What's up, guys? DK here with Collector's Impact, and today we are going to discuss the reserve list. Yeah, fun topic, I know. Kind of a hot button issue when it comes to Magic the Gathering, especially these days. I'm personally not sure why it's such a sensitive issue, as there's quite a lot to say about it, and a lot of valid opinions to be heard. So I wanted to go ahead and contribute mine to this, being that I have been playing this game for a long time. I'm talking since the old days, the very old days. Before there was Vintage, it was just Type 1 kind of a situation. Type 1 and Type 2 Legacy did not exist. So giving you kind of a time frame there of what I was used to back in the day. So having that perspective on it, there's definitely a lot that I have to say about it, and a lot that I wanted to bring attention to, especially in this era of 2021. Now, in this video in particular, I have compiled 5 reasons that I believe that the reserve list is destroying the Magic the Gathering market in its current state. I think that the reserve list has a lot to do with why when you walk into a Target or a Walmart or anything like that, Pokemon is cleared out, sports cards are cleared out, and Magic the Gathering is sitting there on the shelf, barely touched. There's a reason for that, and it has a lot to do with this. So I am not trying to poo-poo on anybody's parade here or anything like that. I'm not trying to be offensive or whatnot. This is very much, I've brought you guys to the biblioplex here so that we can have an intellectual conversation about this topic. And I'll contribute to the conversation with my 20 plus years of experience in the collectibles market, as well as an actual player of this game. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Point number 1. Time is the variable that is breaking this market for Magic the Gathering. Now, what I mean by that is when the reserve list was founded in 1995, let's do a very quick history lesson. I'm sure you guys know a lot of this, but just in case, I will cover it very fast. In 1995, Wizards of the Coast printed this set called Chronicles. It had cards from Arabian Nights, Legends, Antiquities, and the Dark. And in my opinion, they reprinted like some middle-of-the-road kind of cards, this being some of the best examples of the best cards, like the Elder Dragon Legends, Nicobolus, and Palladia Moors here. But it was viewed by the fans as kind of a slight against the player base and the integrity of the game. Surprise, surprise. And Wizards of the Coast somehow actually listened to their complaints in 1995, and they scrambled and they came up with the concept of a reserve list. That's why there are reprints of some of the cards that are on the reserve list, things like Fork that I have out here on the table. This was printed in Alpha, Beta, Unlimited, and Revised. So, Revised is from 1994, so they didn't institute it till 95, so in some lucky instances, you can find cards that were reprinted several times that are still on the reserve list, and those cards are a little bit easier to obtain because of their reprints. But anyway, that is the basic history of the reserve list, why it was instituted, and when it was instituted. So as I was saying here, point number 1 is about time, and what I mean by this is when they cut off the reserve list, it was the year 1999, which was the end of the Urza Saga block. The Urza Saga block, Urza Saga, Destiny, and Legacy, they cut off after that. Cold turkey, adding nothing else to it from that point on, and promising not to really touch what was already there. And for the most part, in 1999, the year 2000, the year 2001, all the way up to, I would say, 2010, really, up to around that time period, maybe even a little bit later, it didn't really matter all too much. And what I mean by that is not enough time had gone by since the reserve list was cut off and the promise from Wizards was kind of left hanging in the wind. The game was still the game. People still played the game. And the cards didn't go crazy in value. overnight. Like in the year 2006, I got a Black Lotus that was signed by Richard Garfield for $700, and I didn't even pay cash. I did trade-in value with some of the Shockland dual lands from Ravnica. So that puts it in perspective. That was 2006. I was able to trade my playsets of those Shocklands from Ravnica and get a Black Lotus. That would be impossible today, to say the least, because of how the market has changed and reacted due to the reserve list. Mostly because of the amount of time that has gone by between its ending and the market today. And as time continues to tick by, the reserve list cards, if Wizards doesn't do anything about the reserve list cards are going to essentially become, or they really have become, a market all their own, entirely separate from the game. Maybe not entirely, but very bordering on that. And in the future, if they don't do anything about this, it will be pretty separate from the game. Gosh, an analogy would almost be like the 1% and the 99% at this point, something like that, where there is a massive skew in terms of the value of those cards, at least the heavy hitters on the reserve list, versus anything else that's produced today or that can ever really be produced by Wizards of the Coast, with a couple of exceptions that have happened in recent times here. I'm looking at you, Jeweled Lotus. And then you couple this with the fact that now investors have gotten into the game, and investors have a very specific list of things to target thanks to the reserve list, which drives the price up. It makes the cards scarce, and the more time that goes by and the more that they have the ability to pick up the cards, it just makes it harder to actually play the game with those specific cards. That's ultimately it. The more time that goes by, the wider the gap gets between the reserve list cards and everything else. And that is a problem for several reasons, and I'll go ahead and cover that in the rest of this video. All right, so with the discussion of time out of the way, let's jump to point number 2, which is an age-old rule in the world, but it definitely applies to this, which is perception is key. Now, what I mean by that is that the definitive nature of the reserve list, its existence, and the cards that are on it, give those cards a sense of inherent collectability. That has come up a lot more in recent years, which is why time is factor number 1, than it ever did in the past. We will use an example like Thrall Champion here. This card is from Fallen Empires. It never really saw very heavy play. It still doesn't see very heavy play, simply because its casting cost is 5. It's a 2/2. And yeah, it gives all your thralls +1/+1. That's fine. And it has some other thing. Take control of target thrall. I mean, it's got more use now because of things like changelings, and there's tons more spells that can, be beneficial to this guy. But this card as a whole, just the fact that it's on the reserve list is what's making it more of a targeted card these days. There are people out there who are doing buyouts and buy-ups of these cards. So we'll get into that on the next point. But for the continued discussion of this, which is perception is key, that's a huge driving factor for the value of the cards. You've got the investors, and they are like, okay, they're never going to reprint Fork again. So Fork is done. It's donezo. It's on the reserve list. I'm going to buy up all these forks. But, is that actually true? I don't think so. And I'll explain that in point number 3 here. Point number 3. Similar cards prove that the market is under more strain than the game itself. And it has a lot to do with this perception. So yeah, when it comes to Fork, they haven't reprinted Fork, and they won't reprint Fork. But check this out, right? They have made these cards and more. But let's go ahead and see this so that you know exactly what I'm talking about here. Any one sorcery or instant spell just cast is duplicated. Treat Fork as an exact copy of target spell, except that Fork remains red. Caster of Fork chooses the copy's target. That's Fork's text. Wow, what a mouthful. Now, check out Reverberate from M12. Same casting cost. It's an instant as well. Copy target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. It's Fork. It is Fork. Like verbatim, that's Fork. And people were probably, upset about this, and that's why it hasn't had too much of a resurgence as well, because it's kind of like a pseudo breaking of the reserve list because it's so similar. So here we go with Time Spiral. What year was this? 2006, the original Time Spiral. You have Reiterate, which costs 1 extra mana. Copy target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for the copy, and it has Flashback, an additional ability. So it's very similar to Fork, and in some cases, depending on how you're using it and in what kind of a deck, it could be better than Fork. Yeah, and then there's also a blue version of Fork, and there's other things like that that exist too. But this right here is one of the things that really sticks out to me and is very important for this conversation. And looking at this card, I almost feel like this is symbolic, or this was intentional by Wizards of the Coast, that the name of the card is Increasing Vengeance. Yeah, I mean, think about that for real. So it costs 2 red mana. It's instant. Copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. If the spell was cast from a graveyard, copy the spell twice instead, and you may choose new copies or new targets for the copies, and it has Flashback of 5. So it is Fork heavily ramped up. If you cast from the graveyard, you get to double it for only 2 mana, plus you can do it all over again from the graveyard. You can cast it and do it all over again. It is an Increasing Vengeance on the reserve list, and how they feel about the reserve list and the people who complain about the reserve list. I mean, there's just a lot to unpack there. The Increasing Vengeance, this card says so much about the state of the cards on the reserve list and Wizards' capability to get around the reserve list in such a way that if you're not savvy in the game and you're just thinking like, okay, Thrall Champion is on a reserve list from Fallen Empires, it's an old card, they're never going to reprint it. Yeah, okay, under the current reserve list rules, that's true. But what is to stop Wizards from making a card that costs 3 mana, one black and 2 colorless, and it gives all Thralls +1/+1, and it has like tap 4 and tap it, and target creature gets a Thrall counter that permanently makes it a Thrall, and then you get this ability still, tap it, take control of a Thrall. What's to stop them from just doing that and completely making the gameplay usage for Thrall Champion worthless in terms of no one would choose this card over that new version that I just stated. And that is really a pretty key thing when it comes to this discussion on the reserve list. And how viable and valuable is it really from a gameplay perspective? It shows, it really, really iterates the difference between the market and the game itself. So that's what I mean in point number 3 here, of that the market is under more strain than the game itself. The game is doing just fine. In fact, Wizards, as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of power creep. A lot of the newer cards are very strong in comparison to the old cards, unless you're looking at specifically things like the Power 9 cards, or some of the other really powerful cards from the original Four Horsemen sets. Pretty much everything else is on par or better than older cards. Even a lot of cards that are on the reserve list. Just to share a few other notable things. This card right here, Days Undoing, is insane to me. And it really shows, like, okay, so this is essentially Time Twister, with the one caveat of if it's your turn, the turn ends, and the turn. It's Time Twister. It costs the same, it's a sorcery, it costs the exact same casting cost, and you get to Time Twister. Just end the turn after. So I have an Underworld Dreams deck, and I use this in there, and it functions so similarly. Like, you can just do a time warp, to gain an extra turn or whatever, and then do the Days Undoing. You get your thing, and then you get another turn right after anyway. It's not a huge hindrance for its casting cost. I mean, it's amazing. The fact that this card is only, $10 or less? and Time Twister is thousands, that shows a very, very clear disparity, in my opinion. And this is really, when I saw this card, I was like, wow, they are pushing the boundaries of the reprinting of the Power 9, but it didn't really cause that big of an uproar. And that comes down to perception as well. I guess a lot of players, just because it has that one little caveat, it's in terms of the game, that's amazing. I mean, it is freaking Time Twister, you guys. It's a really overpowered card, and I'm not sure how it's only worth $10 other than the fact that it has the reserve list stuff holding it back. All right, so let's move on to point number 4, which is titled Reprints in the Era of Flashy Variants. Nothing from 1999 and beyond is sacred. That is very key when it comes to this conversation. Wizards of the Coast, I would say for the last, when did the Master Series come out? 2013? So all the way up until like 2013, the game was still pretty healthy in comparison to the reserve list stuff because Wizards hadn't gone reprint crazy. And then once they started coming out with master sets, they kind of started digging their own grave in relation to the agreement with the reserve list that they had set up. Essentially, Wizards of the Coast didn't understand, and they still don't understand, the power of the reserve list and what that actually was supposed to do, like what it was supposed to really communicate to the player base and to the collector base, more importantly. And when they lost confidence from the collectors, not necessarily the players, but from the collectors, when they started reprinting things over and over and over again in flashier and flashier variants, it kind of got tiring for the collector base, and it removed all forms of trust from an investment standpoint for an average collector. That's why you have all the big money collectors going into the reserve list, and you have little money wannabe collector investors going into smaller things on the reserve list because of that perception of value in those cards, and they don't really care about the game itself so much, and the card's functionality in the game doesn't give as much value as it once did. There's a huge disconnect there. Cards used to be valuable because of what they did in the actual game. And now a card could actually be really amazing, and its value in comparison to what it should be based on past market performance for Magic cards, it's staggering. For example, in 2010 or 2009, when M10 came out, and they introduced the card Baneslayer Angel, that card in regular version, not even foil, just regular, was $50. In 2010, 2009, 2010 era, you're talking about when, right after the 2008 crisis and stuff, people were still coming into the card shop that I was managing, and they were buying that card for $50. Opening packs of cards to try and get it. It was a chase card, and people would pay it. Now, Baneslayer Angel's like $5 because they've reprinted it to oblivion. There's so many copies of it, and now there's even flashier, full art foil variant versions of it, and it's just, it got tiring, and I personally think that the variants are beautiful, but they're not done right because of the hindrance that's there based on the reserve list. It really, I don't even know how to word this, or if I'm wording it correctly for you guys to get what I'm really trying to get at here. I mean, that's really the problem with modern Magic cards, is that everything from 1999 and back, there's a feeling of a true promise and value, inherent collectability, because a lot of those cards can't be reproduced, the ones of value. And now anything is fair game, especially with their introduction of the list. That was almost a nail in the coffin, if you ask me. You've got like variant art cards and promo cards and things that they're reprinting in the list, which for the longest time people were like, oh, promo cards and all that kind of stuff, that's where, it's a pseudo reserve list. Alternate art variants, things like that were considered pseudo reserve lists as a good place to potentially invest in a card that wasn't on the reserve list. When they came up with, quote, the list, man, that did so much damage to that perception as well. And basically no one trusts Wizards of the Coast anymore. Wizards has to do something. They have to act on this. They have to, in order for Magic to correct the course and become the industry leader again. Magic the Gathering was the first card game ever invented. Its history is incredible, but the company and the direction of Wizards right now, it's not healthy, and I hope that they understand that. I have a lot of corporate experience as well, and I just can't even imagine what the internal meetings look like there. They have to know that it's not healthy. When Pokemon is going insane and everything is to the moon, it's not anymore right now, but when that was going on and Magic was stagnant, that's a huge red flag. It should be, and the answer is not printing more flashy variants and new products and stuff. It's figuring out how to balance the value of the reserve list. It really is. Which leads me to my fifth and final point, which is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So, as in 1995, this is what I'm trying to figure out. This is what baffles me, right? In 1995, the wheel got squeaky, and Wizards responded pretty instantly and created the reserve list. But now we've got a different kind of squeaky wheel. You've got people who are, honestly, they're just not as experienced with the overall market, or they don't have full view necessarily of a health of a card game, the health of the card game needing to have a strong secondary market in order for it to be a sustainable and viable business option, and in order for the game to continue. They want, the squeakiness is, they want the cards to remain affordable, right? So they don't want any sort of reserve list. They want to abolish the reserve list. There's a lot of calls for that. Just get rid of it entirely. That is definitely not my solution. So with that, let's jump into what I think would be the actual solution that Wizards of the Coast should do. It makes the most sense from a strategy standpoint and from a market standpoint. Let me know what you guys think. So that would be for them to simply expand the reserve list. And they can do it in any number of ways, but I would say they should honestly do a retroactive expansion of the reserve list. They should pick a minimum of 5 cards from every set from 1999 to now and put them on the reserve list. It doesn't matter if they've already been reprinted. They could have a ton of reprints. I mean, these are some cards that I was just going through my box of stuff and was like, these should theoretically be reserve list cards, or could at least be examples of reserve list cards. If they went ahead and they're like, okay, yeah, Utopia Tree from Invasion, 1 of 5 cards from that set. Here's Counterbalance. I mean, these are cards that they're not excellent. Some of them are. That's kind of how the reserve list is. But it would add so much value and collectability and balance out the entire market for the history of Magic cards from the inception of the game to now, if they would do that, if they would reinstitute a reserve list. I just can't even imagine what it would do to the market. It would revitalize the brand. It would drive all kinds of new speculative type investment people into the space. And that's the best part that people should really think about in terms of, there's the main counter argument to this is, well, if they do that, then if they do that, if they expand the reserve list, then the cards will become through the moon. They'll go through the moon, and we won't be able to buy them anymore and use them in our decks. And if you look at the other points that I had, I really don't think that's the case. I think that the most important thing is point number 2 for that argument. Perception is key. When you're talking about a finite amount of cards with a specific name, we'll use any of these will work. But I mean, you could say Platinum Angel, right? Platinum Angel, 7 mana, 4/4 flying. You can't lose the game. Your opponent can't win the game. There is nothing stopping them from printing another card that costs 6 mana or 8 mana and is a 3/3 with trample and indestructible, or what, you know what I mean? That does the same ability, and it's an artifact. You can get around it functionally in the game. making little compromises to certain cards and still have decks with those cards or based around similar styles of cards and similar style of play to compensate for any cards that may explode in value. Or, the best part is if you've been playing the game for a while and you have a good collection, it would be like an instant reward. It would almost be like a stock split or whatever in your favor. like where your cards that you have, if any of them go on the new reserve list, boom, instant value in the cards that wasn't there before. It would be almost like a big thank you to the player base that's been loyal to them through all of these years that the reserve list has not existed. The main thing to me is balance. You got the yin and yang here because it's super important. Right now, the game is unbalanced. And by that, I do primarily mean the market. But the market and the health of the market is vital to the game's survival and to how the game is perceived and collected and desired. Without balance, this game, I fear for its future. And I love the game. I really do. It's one of my favorite games out there. But Wizards needs to address this issue, regardless of how painful it's going to be for people, or how painful they think it's going to be. I really think that it's not going to be as bad as a lot of people think. Now, on the argument of ending the reserve list entirely, just pull the rug out from the reserve list and start reprinting Black Lotuses and stuff like that, no, that would do detrimental harm to the game because it would be destroying the original promise in addition to just letting everything else kind of fall apart. You know what I mean? That would be like removing the Jenga block if you think about it from a strategy perspective. That's not the way to go, at least not in my opinion. It would do a lot more damage than good, at least in the short term. Now, you could make the argument that it would be like the phoenix rising from the ashes. You just collapse the whole dang system, and then Magic has the ability to rise from the ashes and prosper from there based on other decisions that they could make. That's somewhat viable, but no, I definitely think expanding the reserve list is the way to go, and decently aggressively at that. Minimum of 5 cards from every set. Not just doing these pseudo reserve list things based on certain art or artists and stuff like that. I mean, that would be nice too, to have that in there. But having actual cards on the reserve list, there's nothing stopping Wizards from creating similar cards. They just can't create identically similar cards, which is good. I mean, it makes the cards collectible and desirable. So anyway, I've rambled about this quite a bit. I probably didn't hit every point that I was trying to hit. I'm hoping that I conveyed the message that I'm trying to convey to you guys, because it's actually kind of complicated, and there's a lot to say about it. And I had lots of cards set aside as examples that I wanted to show you and go through. But yeah, there's just so much to say about it that I don't even know where to begin sometimes. So anyway, I hope that you guys like this video. If you found it useful or informative, definitely give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, subscribe to the channel. I would be glad to make any sort of follow-up videos on the reserve list or questions that you may have. So if you have any questions, put them in the comment box. I'll be glad to do my best to answer them, or at least we can get some conversations going down there about it. So thanks again, guys, for coming by. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you back next time. Take care.